Magnificent Delusions by Husain Haqqani, continued. Although India publicly did not support the Afghan claim, Pakistan's early leaders could not separate the Afghan questioning of Pakistani borders from their own perception of an Indian grand design against Pakistan. But Indian leaders, especially Nehru, sought to allay Pakistani fears with public comments affirming India's acceptance of Pakistan. In a speech in March 1948, the Indian Prime Minister explained that there is no going back in history and that India had no desire to strangle and crush Pakistan and to force it into a reunion with India. Nehru asked, "If we had wanted to break up Pakistan, why did we agree to partition? It was easier to prevent it then than to try to do so now after all that has happened." In his view, it would be to India's advantage that Pakistan would be a secure and prosperous state with which we can develop close and friendly relations. He went on to declare that if he were offered the chance to reunite India and Pakistan, he would decline, because "I do not want to carry the burden of Pakistan's great problems. I have enough of my own." India's Secretary-General for External Affairs, Sir Gurjit Shankar Bajpai, told the US State Department that India had no desire to eliminate Pakistan as an independent state or to reincorporate into an Indian Union the territories now held by Pakistan. Recognizing that political reunion was most unlikely in the foreseeable future, the Indians expressed the hope for an understanding on joint defense of the Indian subcontinent and possibly a customs union. This reflected Nehru's vision of a closer association coming out of a normal process and in a friendly way which does not end Pakistan as a state, but which makes it an equal part of a larger union in which several countries might be associated. But none of this changed minds in Pakistan. The country's elite had started defining its national interest solely in ideological terms, with its primary goal to secure itself against India. Ensuring Kashmir's inclusion in Pakistan and resolving the Pashtun question were declared as crucial to completing the process of Pakistan's creation. In this way, settling the unfinished business of partition took priority over everything else. But Pakistan was already short of resources. It needed even more funds to finance the large army it had inherited, an army that was now needed to remain battle-ready for the permanent conflict with India. Within a few months of independence, the army was on the road to becoming the most powerful political actor in the country. Its institutional requirements took priority over all other national needs. Prime Minister Liaquat Ali Khan proudly told troops of the 144th Brigade in Lahore on April 8, 1948, that their government had allocated 75% of its budget for national defense. Moreover, international skepticism about Pakistan's viability and the paucity of resources did not deter its leaders from seeking Western support for the new country, for both its army and its claim over Kashmir. A few months before Pakistan's creation, Jinnah had told General Hastings Ismay, Chief of Staff to the last Viceroy of India, Lord Louis Mountbatten, that Pakistan could not stand alone once the British left. Jinnah felt the need for a superpower ally, even before any shots had been exchanged between the Pakistani and Indian armies in Kashmir. Ismay reported his conversation with Jinnah to Mountbatten. Russia had no appeal for them. France was weak and divided. There remained only England and America, and of these the former was the natural friend. According to Ismay, Jinnah had joked that, apart from anything else, the devil you know is better than the devil you don't. This acknowledgement of the need for Western support for Pakistan differed significantly from Jinnah's earlier stance while discussing Pakistan's defence with the British and Congress leaders. The US ambassador in London, John G. Wynant, reported to the US Secretary of State in February 1946 that Jinnah had been reluctant to commit to joint defence plans for the subcontinent. When Gandhi had apparently raised the question of Pakistan's integration in a common defence plan, according to Wynant, Jinnah had replied that his people looked to linking up with the Arab states. As independence drew closer, the Muslim League leaders realistically re-evaluated their desire for close association with the Arab world. Perceived ideological affinity notwithstanding, there could be no expectation of effective military cooperation from Arab countries. None of them had an armaments industry, nor were they known for maintaining high-quality military training establishments. At the time, the Arab states also did not have foreign currency reserves that Pakistan could tap for imports. Jinnah and most of his lieutenants knew Britain well, but Britain's capacity to get the new country on its feet was limited. The British Empire was exhausted from the recent World War, which had left the United States and the Soviet Union as global superpowers. Most of Jinnah's lieutenants had never travelled to the United States and knew little about American politics or history. Recognizing this need prior to the partition, Jinnah had urged a Cambridge-educated scion of a prominent merchant family, Mirza Abul Hassan Isfahani, to tour the United States in the mid-1940s to drum up support for an independent Muslim state in South Asia. In a November 1946 letter to Jinnah, Isfahani explained what he knew of the American psyche. "I have learnt that sweet words and first impressions count a lot with Americans," he wrote. "They are inclined to quickly like or dislike an individual or organization." Isfahani later became Pakistan's first ambassador to the United States. The British realized that their own influence in their former colony would depend on American interest in the region. During a private luncheon with U.S. Ambassador to India, Henry F. Grady, on July 2, 1947, British Viceroy Mountbatten suggested that the United States should announce its intention of establishing diplomatic relations with Pakistan at an early date. While reporting the suggestion to Washington, Grady added his conclusion that Mountbatten saw an early American commitment of diplomatic representation in Karachi as an aid to him in his negotiations with Jinnah. The Americans deferred to the British and hastened the process of establishing ties with Pakistan. The U.S. Embassy was the first to open in Karachi, then Pakistan's capital, and U.S. diplomats found access to senior Pakistani leaders relatively easy. After his arrival, Paul Alling, the first U.S. ambassador, realized that undoing partition was unrealistic. In a discussion between American ambassadors to India, Pakistan and Burma, Alling agreed with Ambassador to India Grady that it is unlikely that the two nations could get together as they were before partition. He advised that U.S. policy should focus on good neighborliness rather than unity. Even a cursory glance at official records of exchanges between Pakistanis and Americans from these early years reveals Pakistan's almost exclusive focus on U.S. military and economic aid. The unconstrained seeking of aid intensified when, after Ambassador Grady's luncheon with Viceroy Mountbatten, formal talks began regarding a U.S. diplomatic presence in Pakistan. Grady reported that Jinnah had been most cordial, expressed great admiration for the U.S., and said he was hopeful the U.S. would aid Pakistan in its many problems. A few months later, Grady was also the first U.S. diplomat to realize that the United States had to be careful when navigating the treacherous waters of India-Pakistan relations. "Indians are very jealous of everything we do for Pakistan," he told his State Department colleagues. "I am constantly questioned on this point in India. If we made a loan to Pakistan, India would resent it unless we gave the same to India. This applies to all matters right down the line." The United States did not want to choose between a partnership with India or one with Pakistan. Washington was preoccupied with post-war European and Japanese reconstruction, as well as the evolving strategy of containing Soviet communist expansion. But this did not stop Pakistanis from demanding attention as the world's largest independent Muslim country. The most frequent visitor from Karachi to Washington was the Pakistani finance minister, Ghulam Muhammad, who came seeking aid for the new state. The elite in Pakistan's capital at the time, Karachi, were relatively few and often interconnected. The landed gentry from Pakistan's various provinces had bought or taken over large mansions Hindu businessmen had left behind when they migrated to India. Many of these Pakistani elite represented their districts in the Constituent Assembly that doubled as parliament. Muslim civil servants and military officers, largely from India, had taken over positions of responsibility in makeshift offices. A few businessmen, often migrants from India, were also prominent. And American diplomats mingled among these influential people and often found them making identical arguments about Pakistan's future and the ways in which the United States could help the new country. Joseph S. Sparks, who, as vice consul in Karachi, was hardly a policymaker, reported his conversation with local Muslim League leader Yusuf Haroon, a prominent businessman and part owner of Dawn, the quasi-official English newspaper. Pakistan was keen on having a foreign policy that was independent and different from India's, and it counted on American help and assistance, Haroon had told Sparks. Then, less than a month after independence, on September 7, 1947, Jinnah declared at a cabinet meeting, "Pakistan is a democracy, and communism does not flourish in the soil of Islam. It is clear that our interests lie more with the two great democracies, namely the UK and the USA, rather than with Russia." His words were immediately conveyed to American diplomats in Karachi, who duly reported them to Washington. 4 days later, on September 11th, Jinnah announced in another cabinet meeting that it was important for the United States and the West to ally with Pakistan against the Soviet Union. The safety of the northwest frontier is of world concern and not merely an internal matter for Pakistan alone, Jinnah said, hinting that the Soviet Union was already hostile to Pakistan. According to him, it was significant to note that Russia alone, of all the great countries, has not sent a congratulatory message on the birth of Pakistan. But the argument he cited as evidence of Soviet hostility could equally have demonstrated Soviet indifference. After all, at this point, there were no relations between Pakistan and the Soviet Union, and there had been no diplomatic or media reports of Soviet ill feeling toward Pakistan. Thus, Jinnah's comments that Soviets had failed to send a congratulatory message was directed at the United States. Consequently, having taken a position in America's favor, Pakistanis expected the United States to understand their economic and military needs and to offer generous financial support. Also, in early September, Prime Minister Ghulam Mohammed met with Chargé d'Affaires Charles Lewis to discuss the dollars and cents aspect of potential U.S. assistance. These early requests for aid took the United States aback somewhat, particularly as Washington did not share Karachi's view of Pakistan's centrality to U.S. strategy. Although Pakistanis thought their offers of cooperation with the United States merited immediate attention and return benefits, U.S. officials saw no urgency to embrace Pakistan. Pakistani officials' expectations were clearly disproportionate to U.S. diplomats' assessments of Pakistan's value. But Pakistani expectations were not limited to American financing of their new state. Landlords in Karachi wanted American diplomats to rent their properties and pay in dollars. A job with the U.S. Embassy as driver, clerk, or translator was much sought after, and store owners pursued Americans as preferred customers. During a quiet picnic with U.S. Ambassador Paul Alling, Jinnah and his sister Fatima suggested that the ambassador buy their property, the magnificent Flagstaff house, for his embassy. Alling politely informed the Governor-General that the embassy had already obtained another property. The ambassador then sent Jinnah a gift of 4 ceiling fans after he complained about Karachi's sweltering heat. In subsequent decades, especially after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Pakistanis have often complained that the United States failed to reward Pakistan for its contributions during the Cold War. But in 1947 to 1948, Pakistan had yet to do anything for America, yet it still expected huge inflows of US cash, commodities, and arms. There was little discussion among Pakistanis about possible reductions in the size of the army that it inherited from the British so as to lower the fiscal deficit. Furthermore, Pakistani leaders prioritized the political necessity of avoiding Indian dominance over the economic need to retain regional markets for agricultural products. They also rejected ideas of a customs union or closer economic cooperation with India. Instead, Pakistan's leaders convinced themselves that they deserved special consideration from America, and thus they devoted their energies to securing aid from US leaders. But Pakistan's most pressing economic problem related to its external reserves. Around the time Isfahani presented credentials as ambassador in Washington, Jinnah sent Mir Laik Ali, a former advisor to the princely state of Hyderabad, on a mission to Washington to seek a $2 billion loan. Ostensibly, the money was needed for the relief and rehabilitation of refugees who have entered Pakistan in a destitute condition from India. However, US officials politely informed the Pakistani emissary that the US government was not authorized to extend foreign credits for a comprehensive program of this magnitude without prior congressional approval and appropriation. Furthermore, the State Department was not willing to recommend such congressional action. US officials then advised Laik Ali to identify projects that might qualify for financing by the Export-Import Bank, or ultimately by the International Bank. The US government responded to this first specific plea from Pakistan for financial assistance with $10 million in funding from the War Assets Administration, 0.5% of the original request. A detailed request for military equipment met a similar fate. In October to November 1947, Pakistan asked the United States to provide $170 million for Pakistan's army, $75 million for the Air Force, and $60 million for the Navy. Pakistan wanted the United States to help it maintain a regular army of 100,000 to consist of 1 armored division, 5 infantry divisions partly motorized, and a small cavalry establishment, as well as help with payment of personnel. It asked for 12 fighter squadrons, 150 planes, 4 fighter reconnaissance squadrons, 70 planes, 3 bomber squadrons, 50 planes, 4 transport squadrons, 50 planes, and 4 training wings, 200 planes, as well as 4 light cruisers, 16 destroyers, 4 corvettes, 12 Coast Guard gunboats, and 3 submarines. Upon receiving the military shopping list, officials at the State Department and the Pentagon concluded that Pakistan was thinking in terms of the US as a primary source of military strength, and that this would involve virtual US military responsibility for the new dominion. But the United States was not ready to accept this responsibility. We may defeat our own purpose if, by extending assistance to any country in this area, we alienate the friendship of one or more of the other South Asian powers, explained an internal US government report. A few months later, a British government request for transfer from British Lend-Lease stores to the government of Pakistan of 5,198,000 rounds of .30 caliber and 1,091,000 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition was also turned down. President Harry Truman concurred with the views of Secretary of State George Marshall, who was also supported by Secretary of Defense James Forrestal, to impose an informal arms embargo on both India and Pakistan while they fought their war in Kashmir. The Truman administration had determined that it was not in America's interest to insert itself in the middle of the India-Pakistan conflict. To avoid publicity, however, the United States did not impose a formal embargo. Moreover, the United States viewed India as the region's natural leader. State Department and Pentagon officials wrote in a report, "India is the natural political and economic center of South Asia, and aid given to the peripheral countries would have to be adapted to conditions in India." Pakistanis who sought parity with India and were totally averse to any suggestion of India's regional preeminence, however, did not share this view. Thus, the United States had flatly refused to embrace the plan for sustaining Pakistan economically and militarily through large amounts of aid. There were no buyers in Washington for the conception of the new country as the pivot of the world, as Jinnah had described it. This should have led Pakistan to re-evaluate its hopes for a lucrative relationship with the United States. But Pakistan's leaders did not disclose the details of the United States' rejection of their requests for assistance to Pakistan's people, for fear that it would undermine the Pakistani national morale, or even encourage India to join forces with dissidents within Pakistan so as to break up the country. Maintaining the people's hopes for US aid and the prospect of strength and prosperity was important while Pakistan struggled to get on its feet. Pakistan made the demand for aid from rich countries to poorer ones an important plank of its foreign policy. This helped form the widely held view within the country that donor countries were obligated to provide aid that should not be tied to political or policy issues. Pakistani delegations at international conferences emphasized this position. For instance, in November 1947, Isfahani, while leading Pakistan's team to Havana, Cuba, for the UN Conference on Trade and Employment, insisted that the charter of a future international trade organization must unambiguously provide for aid for the world's undeveloped nations, which comprise the majority of the world. But the chief US delegate found the demand unreasonable and likely to sow dissension instead of expanding trade. Then the Pakistani employers delegation to the International Labour Organization conference in San Francisco went even further. They asked for some sort of Marshall Plan, the American plan to help Europe rebuild after World War II, for Pakistan. Prime Minister Liaquat Ali Khan told the United Press in an interview that the United States should initiate an aid package similar to the Marshall Plan to benefit the Middle East and Pakistan. Other voices in Karachi soon joined the chorus. Every country in the earlier stages of its development has needed assistance from outside, argued one columnist. Countries in the Middle East are no exception to this rule, and it is the duty and should be the privilege of more advanced countries, and particularly the USA, to assist them, he elaborated. Although Pakistan was a South Asian country, its appeals for assistance were based on describing it as an extension of the Middle East. However, not everyone in Pakistan agreed with the clamour for US aid. Bengali politicians from the country's eastern wing proposed normal relations with India so that Pakistani farm products could continue to be sold in their traditional markets. Reducing the tensions that the partition had generated would also enable a reduction in the massive defence budget. Left-wing intellectuals also warned that dependence on US assistance might lead to economic subjugation and political tutelage to America. Whatever foreign aid Pakistan accepts must be on terms of its own choosing, the left-wing Pakistan Times opined in one of its many editorials. If American dollars are not available on these terms, our country must look elsewhere for help. The Pakistani left's proposed strategy for industrial development was to seek machinery and technical help from Eastern Europe and to adopt austerity at home. Limiting conflict and reducing military spending were also deemed important. But the emerging Pakistani elite did not find the notion of austerity appealing, nor did they consider trimming the military to levels Pakistan could afford. Then, instead of revisiting the wisdom of their original bet, Pakistan's founders doubled down on seeking alliance with the United States as the source of economic sustenance and military maintenance. Thus, Pakistan initiated elaborate efforts to persuade the United States of Pakistan's value and usefulness as an ally. Pakistani politicians and diplomats charmed Americans in Karachi as well as Washington with their hospitality, during which Pakistani representatives dangled the fear of the young country's people turning against the United States, intelligence about Soviet threats in the region, and offers of military bases and listening posts as instruments to secure American attention. In addition to Ambassador Isfahani's early observation that Americans respond well to sweet words and first impressions, Pakistanis had also figured out that US diplomats read the local press carefully and reported back to Washington everything they heard or read where they were assigned. Americans like being liked, Pakistanis thought. So if reports filter into Washington that some Pakistani officials deeply admire the United States, it could favorably influence American policy toward the country. Thus, Pakistani officials missed no opportunity to highlight Pakistan's support for the United States. Local newspapers often ran articles to induce guilt among American diplomats for not being helpful to a struggling nation whose leaders were so favorably disposed toward this superpower. Foreign Minister Zafrullah Khan made this argument when he said that the well-known friendship of Pakistan toward the US and Pakistan's obvious antipathy to the Russian ideology would seem to justify serious consideration by the US government of the defense requirements of Pakistan. The Muslim League media also raised the spectre that Pakistan may turn against the United States if its needs were not met. In addition, Pakistan tried to balance its Islamo-nationalist aspirations with its pursuit of a Western alliance. That tension came to a head in May 1948, when 3,000 protesters mobbed the US Embassy in Karachi, protesting American recognition of the State of Israel. The United Press reported that leaders climbed on window ledges of the embassy and shouted their protests against recognition of Israel inside. American officials rigged up a loudspeaker, and Ambassador Paul Alling, through an interpreter, promised to convey the Pakistani sentiment to Washington. As American diplomats in Karachi pondered the implications of the protest, they concluded that supporting the pro-US government was key to containing anti-American sentiment. No one suspected that the demonstrations could be part of an orchestrated effort to seek American attention. Jinnah succumbing to tuberculosis in September 1948 jolted Pakistan, leading many analysts around the world to speculate about the future of the country that he had created. Given that Jinnah was a towering personality and his death was indeed a huge loss, concern about its impact on the future of Pakistan was not entirely unfounded. A wire service report from Reuters stated that US diplomatic sources were wondering whether Mr. Jinnah's disappearance from the political scene would weaken Muslim determination to maintain the partition of India. This anonymous report stirred an emotional reaction that US representatives abroad were not accustomed to. Dawn responded with an indignant editorial titled, "To the Americans," which questioned American diplomats' pitifully inadequate understanding of the conception of Pakistan. Instead of responding to the quoted remark as commentary, Dawn reacted as though it were an insidious conspiracy. Far from weakening the Muslim determination to maintain the partition of the Indo-Pakistan subcontinent, the editorial fired back, the demise of the Quaid-e-Azam will strengthen it 1,000-fold. That's our last word to the world. Realizing that the remarks from US diplomatic sources had touched a raw nerve, the US Embassy in Karachi responded, explaining that the editorial in Dawn was based on erroneous interpretation. Dawn ran the embassy's clarification along with another editorial, this time titled, "From the Americans." Although the editor accepted the American clarification, he likewise claimed that the altercation had made clear to all whom it may concern that Pakistan public opinion will not tolerate any attempt by any quarter to question the firmness of our faith in the future of our country. That a simple speculative comment should elicit such reaction indicated Pakistani's prickliness about observations of the country's viability. In the 6 decades since this first Pakistani claim that a single remark in a news report somehow amounted to an attack on Pakistan's integrity, American officials would have to issue many more clarifications, explanations, and apologies. This first angry riposte foretold the rage Americans could expect if they questioned Pakistan's view of events and the nation's sense of self. Following Jinnah's death, a Time magazine article titled "That Man" described Pakistan's founder as a man of hate and the best showman. It accused Jinnah of being double-faced, stating, "He would stalk into meetings wearing his political uniform, native dress with a black astrakhan cap, and whip the Muslims into a frenzy. Sometimes, in his fury, his monocle would pop out of its socket. After meetings, he would go home, change to Western clothes, and be again the suave Western lawyer. Time then suggested that Jinnah's passing might release a new wave of fanaticism, which even he would have opposed, and that his political heirs might seek the final solution for insolvent, disorganized governments: war. The Pakistani media's reaction to this article was ferocious. The Urdu press claimed that the article reflected American malice against Pakistan, and an English-language article by Ghulam Wainuddin, a senior civil servant, described the news magazine as American gutter press and suggested that some wretched malicious Hindu must have said these things to the Time correspondent in India, and he swallowed it, and so did his editor at home. Reflecting what would become a pattern of psychological warfare aimed at US diplomats, policymakers, and journalists, Wainuddin's rebuttal then became personal. Why does this type of American behave so towards us? What wrong have we Muslims or Pakistanis done to them? A friend who has been in America suggests to me that the sex life of some of the American reporters in New Delhi and some American female editors in the land of sexy dates may have something to do with it. Another friend suggests that all this is due to Jewish money and influence. Pakistani public opinion was being shaped against the United States long before US foreign policy provided Pakistanis a reason for anti-Americanism. An implicit threat then followed Muinuddin's ad hominem attack. The people who have maligned our leader, he contended, were the same people who malign the Russians. No Russian newspaper has slandered us so. They seem to be lots more decent that way. In other words, if Americans did not learn to respect Pakistan and its people, Pakistan would turn to the Russians, who had not hurled any criticism or insult toward this new country. The Soviet Union, however, had not changed its conduct, or lack thereof, with Pakistan. Not only had the Soviets not criticized Pakistan or its founder, they in fact had yet to show any interest whatsoever in the world's most populous Muslim country carved out of the British Raj. Pakistan was eager to play the Soviet card when seeking American attention, but to do that, they needed Moscow's interest. Based on the State Department's assessment that India was the more important of the two new dominions, President Truman sent an invitation in mid-1949 for Prime Minister Nehru to visit Washington. Pakistanis saw this as a slight. They expected to be treated at least equally to India. Liaquat, in particular, had invested heavily in developing rapport with US diplomats, but now he felt he had nothing to show to the Pakistani people for his pro-American stance. There had been no progress in Kashmir, aid had failed to flow, and now the Americans preferred Nehru over him as their first South Asian state visitor. Liaquat's efforts, however, had not been in vain. In his book, The United States and Pakistan, 1947-2000, Disenchanted Allies, career diplomat Dennis Cox detailed how American diplomats in Karachi admired the small band of overworked, highly motivated, and idealist civil servants who struggled to establish their new country. Further, junior diplomats had access to government leaders, including Liaquat, and were invited to social functions without regard to rank or status. The gregarious Prime Minister enjoyed entertaining at his home, at times asking American guests to remain for late-night jazz sessions, during which Liaquat enthusiastically beat the drums, Cooks noted. It was hard for the embassy staff not to empathize with the Pakistanis and their view of the troubles with India over Kashmir and other issues. But the assessment in Washington was clearly different. Thus, US diplomats' personal ties with their Pakistani counterparts possibly caused Pakistanis to hold exaggerated expectations that were crushed when Nehru received precedence over Liaquat in Washington. Liaquat then decided to respond to what he saw as an American snub by pretending to turn to the Soviet Union, even though Pakistan had no formal relations with the other world superpower at this time. Pakistan's ambassador to Iran, Raja Ghazanfar Ali, leveraged his personal ties with his Soviet counterpart in Tehran to seek an invitation for Liaquat from Moscow. The ambassador arranged a meeting between Liaquat and the Soviet chargé d'affaires, Ali Aliyev, at dinner, where Liaquat conveyed his interest in visiting the Soviet Union. Aliyev managed to secure an invitation, which was transmitted and accepted through Ambassador Ghazanfar Ali in Tehran. Soon after the invitation, Pakistan and the Soviet Union established diplomatic relations. Although the Soviets did nothing to arrange a trip, and Liaquat never went to Moscow, the news of an invitation had the desired result. Soon after Nehru's visit to Washington, Truman approved an invitation for Liaquat that George McGee, Assistant Secretary of State for Near East Asia, delivered before the year's end during a visit to the region. The first Pakistani official to meet McGee, Finance Minister Ghulam Mohammed, told him that the United States had to appear to treat Pakistan at par with India. It was of the utmost importance, McGee related, that Liaquat was accorded a reception equal to what Nehru received. Mohammed also attempted to convince the United States of the importance of creating an Islamic economic bloc, an idea Jinnah originally introduced. McGee responded by pointing out that Islamic countries' economies were not complementary. Thus, cooperation between countries producing more or less similar goods from primitive agricultural economies, he elaborated, would not yield substantial gains. I did not believe that religion in itself provided a basis for a separate economic grouping, McGee wrote later. He also noted that Mohammed shared details of his speech at the recent Islamic Economic Conference hosted by Pakistan, but that he had edited out anti-Western statements he had made. The American diplomat did not call out the Pakistani official on that doublespeak, instead holding out the promise of economic aid. The visiting U.S. Assistant Secretary of State then told a press conference in Karachi that the U.S. is becoming increasingly aware of the importance of Pakistan and of our relations with Pakistan. This resulted in again kindling Pakistani officials' hopes of becoming an American ally. But others were not convinced. Pakistan Times ran a cartoon of McGee as a Yankee spider wearing a black top hat and smoking a cigar in his web as he attracted Pakistani leaders to their fate, whereas the Civil and Military Gazette's cartoon showed Uncle Sam offering Pakistan an empty hat labelled Foreign Policy, while India was given a hat full of trade agreements and dollar loans. Meanwhile, Pakistan started preparing for Liaquat's trip by creating military shopping lists. Ghulam Mohammed, along with Defence Secretary Iskander Mirza, undertook most of this preparatory work. Both Mohammed and Mirza were civil servants who later became heads of state and played a crucial role both in US-Pakistan relations as well as in Pakistan's subsequent evolution as a national security state. Mirza sought Sherman tanks, tank spare parts, radar equipment, and recoilless guns, among other things, preferably as direct aid, because the country could not afford to spend its limited hard currency reserves on acquiring these commercially. He was aware that the United States had been reluctant in the past to supply Pakistan with military materiel, and assumed this was because America was doubtful of Pakistan's attitude towards communism. In his view, if only Liaquat would clearly spell out where Pakistan stood in the East-West conflict, the Americans would almost certainly loosen their purse strings. But the State Department's 41-page briefing memorandum for the White House ahead of the Liaquat visit offered a very different picture. The entire South Asian region is of relatively secondary importance to the US from a military point of view, it pointed out, adding that one possible value of Pakistan might be as location for US aircraft in event of war with the Soviet Union. But the memorandum emphasized the need not to openly voice the United States' lack of interest in the region, since it negates our oft-expressed interest in helping the region for economic reasons. Consequently, as the Pakistanis were overemphasizing their commitment to the anti-communist cause to secure American interest, the Americans were likewise pretending to be attentive, even though their interest was less than what they publicly stated. This brief for the president explained that Liaquat was well disposed toward the US in Western ways, but had to contend with strong local opinion which still considers Western nations imperialistic. America's relations with Pakistan were basically friendly, it said, while listing US policy on Palestine, leniency towards India in the Kashmir dispute, and favouring India at the expense of Pakistan as irritants. According to the brief, Pakistan's economic requests thus far had seemed impracticable, and the United States could not make available to Pakistan any large quantity of military equipment because other countries facing greater threats than Pakistan needed that equipment. On May 3, 1950, Truman and several cabinet members received Liaquat and his beautiful wife Rana when they arrived at Washington's National Airport. They stayed in the United States for a full 3 weeks, 1 week less than Nehru's 4-week trip almost a year earlier. In Washington, there was the full range of formalities associated with state visits: a formal state dinner, addresses to the 2 houses of Congress, though not a joint session, a press conference at the National Press Club, a dinner hosted by the Secretary of State, and a reception given by Ambassador Isfahani. The Washington Times-Herald covered the Secretary's white tie dinner on its social pages, boasting the headline, "Came and Conquered." Separately, Assistant Secretary of State McGee was impressed by Liaquat's ability to consume alcoholic drinks, forbidden by Islam, without appearing to have drunk at all. But Liaquat's social successes in Washington had to be kept a secret from his own people back home. Only a few months had elapsed since the Prime Minister had committed his government to making Pakistan's constitution subservient to Islamic values. His ability to hold his drink, impressive in Washington, would have destroyed his reputation in Karachi with the mullahs who supported his objectives resolution in Pakistan's legislature. The resolution declared that Pakistan would be an Islamic state run by men according to God's law. He was a big, strong, confident man with considerable international stature, McGee enthused, saying that he found Liaquat to be a man you could do business with. The personal qualities of Liaquat and his wife, he brimming with smiles and she bursting with energy and exuberance, overcame difficult political questions. Liaquat criticized the United States at the University of Chicago, saying that it was interested only in the possibility of a war with the USSR and not in the peace of the world. He wanted America both to increase its aid for the people in the East and to play a more active role in Kashmir, the most dangerous dispute facing the world today. But these remarks were deemed insignificant, and McGee described them as attempts to assuage neutralist public opinion in Pakistan. McGee, the official who was responsible for policy toward South Asia, formed favourable impressions of both Mohammed and Liaquat. They understood how much help they needed if their new state was to survive their keen competition with India and make a go of it, the Assistant Secretary noted. He liked that the Pakistanis sought US aid on US terms and promised support to help the United States build defences against global communism. To McGee and some others in the administration, compared with the wishy-washy neutralist Indians, they were a breath of fresh air. But there was little substantive discussion on Pakistan's wish list, and Liaquat generated a lot less enthusiasm in Washington than Nehru had. The Senate lacked a quorum when the Pakistani leader arrived to address it, and the proceedings were delayed by half an hour. Further, according to Cox, Truman did not even have a business meeting with the Prime Minister, and a session between Secretary of State Dean Acheson and Liaquat, scheduled for after the state dinner, did not take place because the State Department protocol officer failed to inform the Pakistanis. Although Secretary of Defense Lewis Johnson and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of State General Omar Bradley met Liaquat at the Pentagon for functional meetings, they merely noted Pakistan's interest in obtaining arms instead of giving even a nominal response. The Pakistani spin on the visit, however, was markedly different. The visit was meant partly to bolster Liaquat's prestige at home and partly to keep alive the anticipation of American largesse, which was necessary in order to maintain national self-confidence. Dawn described the meetings with Johnson and Bradley as secret and implied that Pakistan's request for arms was being seriously considered. Liaquat ostensibly made the argument that military assistance would serve the interests of the entire free world. He stressed his nation's strategic position and the fighting qualities of her anti-communist Muslim warriors. In response to these reports, there was great excitement in Karachi. Pakistan's media ran details of every event the Prime Minister attended, such as a dinner at International House, New Orleans, and depicted it as a breakthrough in winning American hearts and minds. Liaquat's decision to visit the United States for 3 weeks, when he had not undertaken a similar long trip to any of the Muslim countries, was criticized by Islamists and others who wanted to focus Pakistan's external relations on the Islamic world. Pakistani diplomat Samuel Martin Burke offered an explanation for the relatively long duration of the visit. After the formalities of Washington, Liaquat had spent the rest of his visit introducing Pakistan to Americans, which was necessary because the real reasons for the establishment of Pakistan were not sufficiently understood abroad. Pakistan, Burke argued, was seen as a backward theocratic state as compared to a forward-looking secular India. And Liaquat had encountered several reminders of Americans' ignorance about Pakistan. When introducing Liaquat to the US Senate, Vice President Alban S. Barkley described him as the Prime Minister of Pakistan, which originally was a part of India. A British embassy cable wryly wondered whether the Pakistani Prime Minister had succeeded in convincing US policymakers of Pakistan's importance. Mr. Liaquat Ali Khan probably learnt more about America than Americans learnt about Pakistan, the cable noted. According to the British diplomat writing the cable, at a luncheon a Californian businessman asked Liaquat whether the blank space between the two parts of Pakistan, as shown on the menu card, was Africa. Although the American media covered Liaquat favourably, there were fewer stories about his visit than there had been about Nehru's earlier sojourn. The New York Times described his anti-communist statements as heartwarming and saw them as a pledge that the Pakistanis will stand and be counted among those who are devoted to freedom, regardless of the cost. In a Foreign Policy Association meeting in New York, Liaquat elucidated Pakistan's security needs in relation to India, while also declaring unequivocal opposition to communism. There have always been certain sections of opinion in India which resented the birth of Pakistan, he said, adding, if they accepted it, they did so with strong mental reservations. According to Liaquat, even after the creation of Pakistan, its territorial integrity was constantly under threat. But the creation of Pakistan would not lead to instability in Asia, as many people believed, but instead to stability. Pakistan could be a useful ally for the West, and the United States should grasp the hand of friendship that Pakistan was extending. Liaquat emphasized Pakistan's key strategic location in Asia with its eastern wing bordering Burma, making it a part of Southeast Asia. In addition, Pakistan's western wing bordered Iran and Afghanistan, and was thus important with respect to any communications to and from the oil-bearing areas of the Middle East. His argument was simple. If Americans helped with Pakistan's existential challenges, Pakistan could help protect American strategic interests in both Southeast Asia and the Middle East. Earlier in the trip, during his press conference at the National Press Club, Liaquat was asked how large an army he envisaged for Pakistan. He replied that this depended on this great country of yours. If your country will guarantee our territorial integrity, I will not keep any army at all. In response, George Kennan, Counselor of the State Department, decided to reply candidly to Liaquat's plea for America to assume responsibility for Pakistan's security. After Liaquat's speech at the Foreign Policy Association, Kennan said that the United States had to act with great prudence and restraint and observe the utmost care not to enter into relationships which might become the subjects of misunderstandings either here or in the partner country or elsewhere. Kennan's message was clear. Pakistan should not pin inflated hopes to the United States. We want our friends to understand the complexities of our situation and to refrain from expecting us to do things which we cannot do, Kennan went on. You will note I say our friends must not expect us to do things which we cannot do. It is no less important that they should not expect us to be things which we cannot be. But the overall success of the Prime Minister's visit prevented Kennan's message from being fully understood in Pakistan. Defence Secretary Mirza and others supposed that military aid would now be forthcoming. Coinciding with Liaquat's visit to America, North Korea began its invasion of South Korea, leading to the Korean War. Pakistan then supported the US effort to send troops to Korea under the UN flag, and even lobbied Arab states in the United Nations on Washington's behalf. When Secretary of State Dean Acheson thanked Isfahani for Pakistan's support, officials in Karachi immediately saw an opportunity to ask for military equipment as payoff for Pakistani support. But Isfahani warned Mirza in a letter that Mirza was being overly optimistic. Advising realism, Isfahani wrote, "We have had in the past promises for the sympathetic consideration of our demands, but unfortunately, none of them have so far borne fruit. I shall therefore be pleasantly surprised if anything materializes on this occasion as well." Commenting on Mirza's request to ask the Americans for 200 latest type tanks, Isfahani observed, "Your optimism really startles me. Those are still on the top secret list and have not yet been made available to even the Atlantic Pact countries." The Pakistani embassy in Washington had a clearer idea of the conditions that the United States might attach if it agreed to provide arms for the Pakistani military. Pakistan, Isfahani explained, would most likely have to limit the use of American weapons to legitimate self-defense and guarantee that it would not undertake any act of aggression against any other state. Mirza saw no problem with the conditions. Pakistan will be expected to help with our armed forces in a situation like Korea, where the UN asked the nations for armed help against North Koreans, Mirza retorted. But in the view of what has happened in the past, Pakistan can limit her help to declarations in favor of the UN. As the war in Korea began, the United States sought troops for the war from several countries, including Pakistan. Based on Liaquat's conversations during his trip, the Pentagon considered Pakistan a prime candidate for providing a contingent for the UN force assembled under the command of General Douglas MacArthur. Indeed, the only reference to Pakistan in Truman's memoirs relates to MacArthur's discussion about the countries from which he expected to draw troops. These American requests in turn created a false impression in Karachi. Liaquat and his team overestimated the American need for Pakistani soldiers. Liaquat told Ambassador Avra Warren that if the United States needed Pakistan's help, it should reciprocate by helping Pakistan in its disputes over Kashmir and Afghanistan. Liaquat said bluntly that now is the time for decision, Warren reported to Secretary of State Acheson. Pakistan would move with the Americans not only in Korea, but also in the Middle East, and to commit themselves irrevocably to issues of interest to the United States. But the US must give him a commitment that will assure his people. Liaquat then offered one or more division for use in Korea out of 7 now under arms, in return for US support against Nehru's defiance of the UN with the threat of a rigged election in Kashmir this summer. According to Warren, Liaquat also wanted the United States to bring our influence to bear in Afghanistan and put an end to what Liaquat described as the Pashtun nonsense. US Ambassador Warren sympathized with Liaquat's proposed quid pro quo and in response recommended strengthening the UN resolution on Kashmir and accepting the offer of a Pakistani infantry division for Korea. He also suggested that we ask Liaquat what practical assistance he needs for Pakistani's military and industrial posture to assist in defense of Middle East from commie aggression. But Acheson, known for being one of the wise men of the emerging US foreign policy establishment, wrote back, saying that the United States did not need Pakistani troops in exchange for complete and unqualified support on Kashmir and Pashtun issues. Pakistan, Acheson replied, should send troops to Korea as a responsibility under the UN Charter, and should not use it as a bargaining tool. The United States would equip and maintain the Pakistani division in Korea, but could not accept Liaquat's proposal. According to Acheson, aligning with Pakistan in its regional disputes would completely alienate India and Afghanistan, and thus limit US freedom of action in dealing with complex present and future issues in Asia. Pakistan had proposed a transactional relationship, but Acheson had turned it down. The decision reflected the State Department's annual policy statement, which identified relatively modest goals in US-Pakistan relations. It described the orientation of its government and people toward the US and other Western democracies and away from the USSR as America's fundamental interest in Pakistan. The US government understood that Pakistan remains dependent upon outside assistance for defense and for economic development, and was willing to assist Pakistan within the limits of our capabilities. But the United States gained no advantage by getting entangled in regional issues on behalf of Pakistan. The Truman administration also sought to discourage any notion of America having unlimited capacity or intention to assist Pakistan in its defense and development. If disruptive forces remain in check, the US policy statement predicted in 1950, Pakistan will emerge after India as the strongest power between Turkey and Japan on the periphery of Asia. But it also said prophetically that the United States would have to remind the Pakistanis that we are neither pro-Indian, pro-Israel, nor anti-Muslim. Although Acheson and his colleagues preferred not to get involved in the India-Pakistan rivalry, India's refusal to support the West in the evolving Cold War continually annoyed them. For instance, India sided with the Soviet Union and Communist China in opposing the peace treaty with Japan on grounds that it failed to provide for return of the island of Formosa, Taiwan, to China. Further, Indian Prime Minister Nehru did not support the US position on Korea, suggesting instead that if Beijing had its rightful representation in the UN Security Council, war could have been averted. Acheson later observed in his memoirs that Nehru was one of the most difficult men with whom I have ever had to deal. The United States' refusal of his conditional offer of support in Korea stunned Liaquat. Nonetheless, his government did not give up hopes of getting arms and political support from America to use against India and Afghanistan. Meanwhile, the urgency of US economic assistance for Pakistan in order to maintain the balance of payments eased somewhat as the global market price of principal commodities rose due to what came to be known as the Korean War boom, though the need for defense assistance persisted. Pakistani officials considered that a stronger anti-communist stance in Karachi was the right formula for getting what Pakistan really wanted from the United States. Then, in October 1951, Liaquat was assassinated while addressing a public rally in the garrisoned town of Rawalpindi. The lone gunman was a disgruntled Pashtun, motivated by what he perceived to be the Prime Minister's un-Islamic attitude. The killing came on the heels of a coup attempt by disgruntled military officers earlier in the year, and this had been tenuously linked to a group of communist intellectuals. The officers seeking to overthrow the government wanted more robust military operations in Kashmir. Although he had sought arms for Pakistan's military, ostensibly to fight communists, the two issues that cast a long shadow on Liaquat's time as Prime Minister were ultimately the Pashtun and Kashmir disputes. Liaquat was Jinnah's undisputed successor, and his assassination left Pakistan without a unifying charismatic leader. Power passed into the hands of a group of civil servants led by Ghulam Muhammad and Iskander Mirza. This group had been most eager in pursuing the option of large-scale American aid as the means of consolidating the fledgling Pakistani state. Now that Liaquat was out of the way, they had a powerful ally in Sandhurst-trained General Mohammed Ayub Khan, who had become the first Pakistani to command its army after taking over from British General Sir Douglas Gracey. The enthusiasm Jinnah's campaign generated for Pakistan had by now begun to wane. The Muslim League splintered into factions, resulting in frequent changes of government ministers and increasing reliance on the military as the source of stability. The ill-defined ideal of a South Asian Muslim homeland was now mired in fractious feudal politics, as generals and civil servants scrambled to put together plans for their country's security and prosperity. Chapter 2. Aid, Arms and Bases. On a warm Friday in June 1953, Pakistani and American dignitaries, flanked by an army band, assembled alongside the wharf in Baltimore Harbor. The SS Anchorage Victory was setting sail for Karachi with 9,000 tons of wheat, the first shipment of 700,000 tons to be donated under the United States-Pakistan Wheat Aid Act. This came about after Pakistan faced 2 successive crop failures due to lack of monsoon rains, and did not have hard currency to buy wheat on the international market. The State Department had concluded that there was a real danger of famine in Pakistan, and a grant in aid from US wheat surpluses was considered the only practical way of preventing famine. Borrowing was an option, but Pakistan's ability to repay the loan without retarding economic growth was questionable. So President Dwight D. Eisenhower asked the 83rd Congress to authorize the administration to send up to 1 million tons of wheat to Pakistan, valued at $75 million. The Congress acted quickly to pass the Pakistan-specific law, and shipments began within 2 weeks of the President's request. "Everything about this action is commendable," said a New York Times editorial. "It would relieve distress in Pakistan and would serve as the mark of our friendly concern with the needs of others." On the Pakistani side, the semi-official Dawn described the American decision to provide wheat as a noble gesture. But the paper carefully avoided expressing gratefulness. Instead, it insisted that Pakistan's food security could be guaranteed only after it had absorbed Kashmir and ensured control of the sources of rivers flowing into it. Although the famine that had just been averted had little to do with Kashmir, Dawn suggested that it did. The Americans had helped solve the immediate problem, but apparently they also needed to resolve the India-Pakistan dispute to earn true appreciation. Internal discussions within the Eisenhower administration had also focused on Pakistan's famine less as a humanitarian problem than as a political one. The US mission sent to Pakistan to examine the wheat shortage had concluded that it was in the security interests of the US to extend food assistance to Pakistan at the earliest. In addition to averting the threat of famine, officials were concerned about the possible political and financial collapse of the friendly government of an important and strategic country. The US ambassador, Avra Warren, had reported some time back that the Soviets were willing to barter 400,000 tons of wheat in exchange for Pakistani cotton and jute. Although there had been no independent confirmation of this offer, the United States felt that keeping Pakistan in the Western camp was important. The Wheat Aid Act marked the first major success in Pakistan's wooing of America. The election of Eisenhower, a Republican, as US President, aided Pakistan's relationship with the United States. Eisenhower was overall tougher about confronting the Soviet Union, and India's stubborn refusal to get drawn into the Cold War further helped Pakistan's case. During the presidential election campaign, Eisenhower aides had spoken of their plans for bringing strategically situated Pakistan into the free world's defense system, and for building a Pakistani army and eventually locating American airfields there. Additionally, the new Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, saw the world in Manichaean terms. He did not know much about the subcontinent, but he did know that a willing ally was preferable to someone who preferred to sit on the sidelines of the great ideological conflict of the age. Dulles had told the New York Times soon after Eisenhower's election that the strong spiritual faith and martial spirit of the people of Pakistan make them a dependable bulwark against communism. But Dulles had been wary of India's leaders long before he became Eisenhower's Secretary of State. British conservatives, many of whom saw India unfit for self-governance and a potential target for Soviet penetration after British withdrawal, heavily influenced his view of South Asia. Months before partition, Dulles had told the National Publishers Association in New York that in India, Soviet communism exercises a strong influence through the interim Hindu government led by Jawaharlal Nehru. Ironically, the interim government Dulles criticized also included representative of Jinnah's Muslim League. But Dulles had already made up his mind that the Muslims were inherently anti-communist, whereas the Hindus were willing to let communism influence them. Because the US Embassy in New Delhi rejected this suggestion, Secretary of State Marshall undertook to try to give Dulles a more complete picture of the Indian situation. Later developments proved that Dulles never got that complete picture and maintained the prejudice he had initially voiced. Under Dulles's stewardship, the Eisenhower administration moved from Truman's cautious policy of Soviet power containment to a more aggressive anti-communism stance throughout the world. He and many others saw Asia as the major battleground against communist ideology. The Soviet satellites in Europe, he reasoned, had seen better days, so they were predisposed to resisting Soviet influence. In Asia, however, the reverse was true. The Soviet system could be seen in poverty-ridden Asian nations as a better option. The Russian intruding into Europe is viewed as an Asiatic, remarked Foreign Affairs columnist C.L. Salzberger, explaining how Dulles viewed the world. The same Russian intruding into Asia comes as a European. The United States had to make sure that Asian states did not succumb to the temptation of embracing communist ideology in a quest for superior social organization, modernity, and literacy, as the region's illiterate, impoverished feudality offered fertile ground for communism to advance. So the United States preferred allies who prioritized resisting communism to those who focused on changing living conditions at home, even if it involved doing business with the Soviets. Muhammad Ali Bogra, who had succeeded Isfahani as Pakistan's ambassador to the United States, had seen an opportunity for Pakistan as he watched the US presidential election campaign in 1952. He calculated that Pakistan could secure economic and military aid by portraying itself as a frontline state in the battle against communism. With this in mind, Bogra, the scion of a Bengali aristocratic family, arrived in Washington months before Eisenhower's election and ingratiated himself with the Republican elite. He went bowling with hardline anti-communists and convinced them of Pakistan's anti-communist credentials. He also advanced the idea that Pakistan's army was the only army in the region willing to fight Soviet influence and incursions. That there was no significant Soviet influence in the region hardly mattered to men like Dulles, who were eager to implement their grand global strategy. But Pakistan's domestic politics at the time were chaotic and Byzantine. Ghulam Mohammed, the powerful former finance minister, was now Governor-General. National elections had been postponed indefinitely, and political factions vied for influence in an environment of palace intrigue. Those in power were primarily concerned with the paucity of resources to run the government, as well as to maintain the British-inherited army. Along with Defence Secretary Iskander Mirza and the Army Commander General Muhammad Ayub Khan, the Governor-General concerned himself with securing economic and military aid for Pakistan more than other political concerns. Within months of Eisenhower's inauguration, Governor-General Mohammed decided to appoint Bogra as Prime Minister, hoping that his standing in Washington would help with Pakistan's quest for aid. Bogra was ensconced as Prime Minister when Dulles visited 12 countries in an attempt to rally Middle Eastern and South Asian countries in a global crusade against communism. The US Secretary of State was received warmly in Pakistan, but felt that the Indians rebuffed him when they told him outright that they would not join any military alliance. Even before independence, Nehru had declared that India would keep away from the power politics of groups aligned against one another, which have led in the past to world wars, and which may again lead to disasters on an even faster scale. On several occasions, Nehru tried to explain to American officials that his vision for India was one of non-alignment, not neutrality in the US-Soviet struggle. Although his sister, Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit, while serving as New Delhi's ambassador in Moscow right after independence, told her US counterpart that most Indian leaders knew that their natural alignment was with the West, Nehru recognized India's relative impotence. He felt that a nation still in swaddling clothes should not talk about military participation in event of war. Pandit's view, which her brother shared, was that India's role in the family of nations should be modest and relatively humble, until the nation had solved some of its basic internal problems. Conversely, Pakistani leaders saw external alliances as a means of addressing their domestic issues. They were all too willing to privately discuss joining a US-led military alliance as long as assurances of arms and aid accompanied it. They also sought US support in Pakistan's conflicts with Afghanistan and India. Without realizing the complexity of the issues involved, Dulles thought he could help Pakistan cut a deal with its neighbors. American officials also ignored the Pakistani government's policy of keeping discussions of alliance with the United States secret from the country's parliament and media. The calculus of the Ghulam Mohammed Mirza Ayub trio was that they would bargain for the highest bidder for Pakistan's support. The absence of political support at home would serve as a convenient way of getting out of fulfilling promises to Americans, as well as being the basis for renegotiating that price. On his return, Dulles identified 4 sources of what he said was fear, bitterness, and weakness in the Middle East-South Asia region. In addition to the overwhelming poverty of the entire area, he felt that the United States could enlist the region's nations as allies after solving 3 quarrels: the Egyptian-British dispute over the Suez Canal, the Arab-Israeli hostility, and the India-Pakistan dispute over Kashmir. This view was somewhat simplistic, as history demonstrates that only one of the 3 has been resolved 6 decades later. After the failed Anglo-French-Israeli invasion of 1956, France and Britain no longer own the Suez Canal. This audiobook is continued on Disc 3.